Look, if you can't even afford a uniform, you don't belong here, lady. Go get my coffee. The crowd of young soldiers laughed, a wave of nervous, complicit chuckles that filled the sterile air of the mess hall. The woman, who had been quietly reading a technical schematic on her tablet, didn't even flinch. She simply remained still, a focal point of profound calm in a sea of adolescent mockery. But when the grizzled base commander, Colonel Thorne, saw the name on the spine of the digital manual she was reading from across the room, his blood ran cold. He knew what that name meant, and he knew the storm that was about to break over the head of one very ignorant private. If you believe that true authority is earned in silence and demonstrated through competence, not shouted through arrogance, type respect below. This is the story of how a single cup of coffee taught an entire military base the difference between rank and power, and how the quietest person in the room is often the most important. It began, as most lessons in humility do, with an act of profound disrespect born from pure, unadulterated ignorance. The air in the Fort Kellerman Consolidated Dining Facility was thick with the smell of industrial-grade bacon and the low, rumbling murmur of hundreds of conversations. It was a cathedral of routine, a place where soldiers from the greenest private to the most seasoned non-commissioned officer came to refuel their bodies before another day of training, another day of preparing for a world that demanded their constant vigilance. Into this predictable ecosystem walked Private First Class Derek Miller, a young man who wore his uniform like a suit of armor and his arrogance like a crown. Miller was the kind of soldier who mistook volume for authority and sarcasm for wit. He moved through the world with the unearned confidence of someone who had never truly been tested, his voice a constant, grating presence in the controlled chaos of the morning rush. He and his small entourage of like-minded privates found a table near the windows, their laughter loud and sharp as they traded stories that grew more heroic with each telling. It was in this moment that his eyes fell upon her. She sat alone, a small island of tranquility amidst the churning currents of military life. She was a black woman, perhaps in her late 30s, dressed in simple gray slacks and a plain blue blouse that seemed utterly out of place among the sea of digital camouflage. Her hair was pulled back in a neat, functional bun, and she wore a pair of simple, unadorned glasses that rested on the bridge of her nose as she focused intently on the tablet in her hands. There was nothing remarkable about her, nothing to suggest she was anything other than a civilian contractor, a librarian, or perhaps an administrative assistant who had wandered into the wrong building. This assumption, a weed grown in the fertile soil of Miller's prejudice, was all it took. He saw her civilian clothes, her gender, her race, and in the crude calculus of his mind, he saw someone beneath him, someone he could use to amuse his friends. He sauntered over, his friends trailing behind him like pilot fish. He leaned over her table, deliberately invading her personal space, casting a shadow over the complex diagrams on her screen. She did not look up. Her focus remained absolute, her fingers tracing a line of code that described the quantum entanglement protocols for a system Miller couldn't even pronounce. "Hey," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This seating is for military personnel. You lost." She finally looked up, her eyes calm and analytical. They were the eyes of a person who solves problems, not a person who starts them. There was no fear, no anger, no indignation. There was only a quiet assessment, as if she were diagnosing a fault in a complex piece of machinery. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear, and she returned her gaze to the tablet. The dismissal, polite as it was a lit match to Miller's ego. His friend snickered, his face flushed. He needed to reassert the dominance he felt was his birthright in this building. He held up his empty coffee mug. "Well, since you're just sitting here, not doing anything important, go give me a refill. Black, 2 sugars." It wasn't a request. It was an order, a deliberate and public act of humiliation. The nearby tables fell silent. Soldiers turned to watch, their faces a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity. They were witnessing a power play, a social culling, and no one wanted to intervene. The woman looked from her tablet to his outstretched mug, and then back to his face. For a moment, a flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. Not anger, but perhaps disappointment, the quiet sigh of an engineer discovering a fundamental design flaw in a system she had hoped would work perfectly. "No," she said, the single syllable carrying more weight than all of Miller's blustering. The rejection, so simple and so absolute, sent a ripple of shock through the onlookers. Miller's face twisted into a mask of theatrical disbelief. "What did you say to me?" he snarled, his voice rising. He took a half-step back, grabbed his own full cup of lukewarm coffee from his table, and with a performative flourish, he turned it over, emptying its contents directly onto her tablet in her lap. A collective gasp went through the room. The brown liquid dripped from the edge of the table, pooling on the polished linoleum floor. The screen of her advanced, military-grade tablet flickered and died. The stains spread across the fabric of her gray slacks. And in that moment, in the face of such a juvenile and insulting act, she did the one thing no one expected. Nothing. She didn't scream. She didn't stand up. She didn't cry out in anger. She simply sat there, looking at the ruined device, then at the mess on her lap, with a profound and unnerving stillness. She slowly reached for a napkin, and with the methodical precision of a surgeon, began to dab at the screen of her tablet, her movements economical and devoid of any wasted energy. It was this silence, this absolute refusal to give him the reaction he craved, that truly broke him. Her calm was a mirror reflecting his own childishness, and he couldn't stand the sight. He was about to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse when a new voice cut through the tension like a diamond blade through glass. "Miller." The voice was quiet, but it carried the unmistakable weight of command. Every soldier in the room, including Miller, instinctively straightened their posture. Captain Eva Rostova stood 20 feet away, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed into icy slits. She was a commander of the base's elite cyber operations unit, a woman known for her sharp intellect and zero tolerance for incompetence. She had seen the entire exchange. Miller, caught off guard, stammered, "Ma'am, this civilian was being disrespectful." "Silence," Rostova commanded. She walked forward, her boots making sharp, rhythmic clicks on the floor. She didn't look at Miller. Her eyes were fixed on the woman and on the dead tablet in her hands. A look of genuine concern, almost reverence, softened the captain's hardened features. She knelt down beside the woman's chair, ignoring the puddle of coffee on the floor. "Dr. Reed," Captain Rostova said, her voice now filled with a deep and profound respect that stunned the entire room. "Are you all right? Is the device compromised?" The woman, Dr. Reed, finally looked away from the tablet and met the captain's gaze. "The chassis is fluid-resistant to military specifications," she said softly, her voice still impossibly calm. "But the kinetic shock from the uninvited thermal transfer may have damaged the primary logic board. I'll need to run a full diagnostic." The technical language, spoken with such casual authority, hung in the air, a foreign dialect that no one, especially not Private Miller, could comprehend. The entire incident, from Miller's initial insult to the spill, had set in motion a chain of events that would ripple through the very foundations of the base. It was more than a confrontation. It was a catalyst. The universe, it seemed, had decided that it was time for a lesson to be taught, a lesson that would be paid for with the currency of one soldier's career and cemented with the demonstration of a level of competence so profound it bordered on the supernatural. The quiet woman was not just a civilian. She was a force of nature disguised in plain clothing, and the first tremors of the earthquake her presence would cause were just beginning to be felt. The foundation of Fort Kellerman's rigid social structure, built on the visible markers of rank and uniform, was about to be shattered by the quiet, undeniable power of a mind that operated on a completely different plane of existence. The world of Private Miller was about to shrink to the size of a single, catastrophic mistake, while the world of Dr. Evelyn Reed was about to be revealed in all its terrifying, awe-inspiring scope. The silence that followed Captain Rostova's words was heavier than the oppressive humidity of the Georgia summer outside. The soldiers who had been snickering moments before now stared at their trays, suddenly finding the pattern of their powdered eggs intensely fascinating. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a tectonic event. Private Miller stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the gears in his head grinding as he tried to process the impossible scene unfolding before him. His captain, was kneeling in a puddle of spilled coffee, addressing a civilian woman with the deference one might reserve for a visiting general. The use of the title doctor was a clue, a breadcrumb he couldn't quite follow to its logical conclusion. His brain, conditioned to see the world in a simple binary of uniform versus civilian, subordinate versus superior, simply could not compute this new data. He defaulted to the only thing he knew: misplaced indignation. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he began, his voice a pathetic squeak compared to its earlier boom, "she's a civilian. She shouldn't even be in this facility without an escort, let alone—" Captain Rostova rose to her full height, turning to face him with a slowness that was more menacing than any sudden movement could ever be. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, were devoid of all warmth. "Private Miller," she said, her voice dangerously low, "your understanding of protocol is as deficient as your judgment of character. You are to remain silent until I address you again. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled, his bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. Rostova turned her attention back to Dr. Reed, who had successfully powered down the damaged tablet and was now carefully wiping the last of the coffee from its casing with another napkin. Her focus was absolute, her composure a silent, damning indictment of Miller's tantrum. "Doctor," Rostova said, her tone professional but laced with an undercurrent of genuine apology, "I cannot overstate how sorry I am for the conduct of my subordinate. His actions are inexcusable and do not reflect the values of this command." Dr. Reed looked up, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The hardware is designed to withstand harsh environments, Captain. It's the operator who is the most common point of failure. It's an acceptable risk." The statement was so perfectly neutral, so devoid of personal animosity, that it was somehow more cutting than any insult she could have hurled. She was speaking of Miller not as a person, but as a faulty component, a variable that had introduced an error into the system. It was in that precise moment that the base-wide alert system shrieked to life. "This is not a drill. Warning." The message repeated, a digital death knell that signaled a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The Cerberus event was a myth, a boogeyman used by instructors to scare new recruits in cyber warfare school. It was the theoretical, unbreakable systems equivalent of total organ failure, a simultaneous, cascading collapse of every primary, secondary, and tertiary network on the base. The power grid, communications, security systems, and most critically, the multi-billion-dollar Aegis combat simulation hub, all of it was designed to be independent, redundant, and fail-proof. A Cerberus event meant that something had gone so profoundly wrong that the very laws of the base's digital physics had been broken. Panic, a virus far faster than any computer code, erupted in the mess hall. NCOs began shouting orders, trying to herd the bewildered soldiers towards their emergency muster points. Amidst the chaos, only 3 people remained perfectly still: Captain Rostova, whose face had gone pale with professional dread; Private Miller, who was paralyzed by a fear he had never known; and Dr. Evelyn Reed, who had just closed her eyes. She wasn't praying. She wasn't panicking. She was listening. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she could hear the dying screams of the servers in the command center a half-mile away. She was processing, analyzing, and understanding the nature of the failure with a speed that no diagnostic program could match. After a moment of this intense, internal communion with the chaos, she opened her eyes. They were sharp, focused, and utterly alive with purpose. The core programming needs to be rewritten. Manually. From the God Box was the slang term for the central command nexus of the Aegis simulator, a shielded, cooled chamber that housed the master server and its quantum processing core. It was the digital heart of Fort Kellerman, and according to the wailing alarms, Miller, She commanded, her voice like cracking ice. "You're with me. You are going to witness firsthand the consequences of your assumptions." Miller, swept up in a tide of events he couldn't comprehend, could only nod numbly and follow, a ghost at the feast of his own making, trailing in the wake of the quiet woman he had tried so desperately to humiliate. He was about to get a front-row seat to a miracle or a meltdown, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his life would be irrevocably defined by what happened next in the heart of the dying machine. He was no longer a soldier heading to a crisis. He was a sinner being led to the altar to witness a sermon of fire and code, delivered by the very person whose temple he had so casually defiled. The journey to the Aegis Combat Simulation Hub was a blur of flashing lights and panic shouts. The entire base was in a state of controlled pandemonium. But inside the bubble of focused calm that surrounded Dr. Reed, there was only purpose. She moved not with the frantic energy of a first responder, but with the deliberate, measured pace of a master craftsman approaching a delicate and complex job. She saw the chaos not as a threat, but as a data set, a series of problems to be solved in a logical sequence. Upon reaching the hub, a state-of-the-art facility that looked more like a corporate tech campus than a military building, they were met by a team of frantic technicians and cyber specialists. The lead technician, a master sergeant named Corman, his face slick with sweat, rushed to Captain Rostova. "Ma'am, it's a complete meltdown. We've lost everything. The core is fluctuating, threatening a full physical burnout. We try to access the system, and the system uses our own access codes to lock us out. It's learning. It's fighting back." Rostova nodded grimly, her eyes on Dr. Reed. "Master Sergeant, this is Dr. Reed. You will give her anything she requires. Her authority in this facility is absolute." Corman, a man with 20 years of experience who had built half these systems with his own hands, looked at the unassuming civilian woman with open skepticism. "With all due respect, Captain, we have our best people on this. What can a civilian—" "She is not a civilian, Master Sergeant," Rostova cut in, her voice sharp as shrapnel. "She is the civilian. Now stand aside." The command was so final, so absolute, that Corman and his team simply parted, creating a path to the reinforced titanium door of the main control room. Dr. Reed walked through them without a word, her eyes already scanning the emergency status displays above the door, absorbing terabytes of data at a glance. She placed her hand on the biometric scanner. A red light flashed. "Access denied." The computerized voice was flat, mocking. The system was already locking out its own creators. Private Miller, standing at the back of the group, felt a perverse sense of vindication. See? She couldn't even get in. But Dr. Reed didn't seem surprised. She turned to Corman. "Give me a terminal. Hardline access." Command prompt only a technician wheeled over a crash cart, a ruggedized laptop on stand. Dr. Reed didn't sit. She stood before the screen, her back straight, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. And then she began to type. It wasn't typing as Miller understood it. It was a symphony of motion, a fluid, unbroken stream of characters that filled the black screen with impossibly long strings of code. Her fingers didn't seem to strike the keys, but rather flow over them, a blur of practiced, perfect efficiency. The room fell silent. The only sound, the soft, rhythmic clicking of the keyboard and the frantic, distant whine of the dying servers inside the Godbox. The technicians, who lived and breathed code, watched in stunned disbelief. She wasn't using any known language or protocol. She was writing in pure machine code, speaking directly to the system's most primitive foundational layer. It was the equivalent of a linguist abandoning all language and communicating with another human being by directly manipulating their raw brainwaves. She was bypassing the conscious mind of the machine and talking straight to its soul. After a few moments of this furious, silent work, she stopped. She hit the enter key with a soft, final tap. On the main door, the biometric scanner flashed from red to green. A heavy clunk echoed through the room as the magnetic locks disengaged. Access granted. The door hissed open, revealing the Godbox. The room was a maelstrom of sensory overload. Alarms blared. Emergency lights cast the room in a hellish red glow. And the central quantum core, a massive, suspended sphere of crystalline lattices and humming hardware, was pulsing erratically, threatening to overload. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, the scent of burning electronics. Without hesitation, Dr. Reed walked into the heart of the storm. She moved with an eerie calm, her steps sure and steady as she navigated the chaos. She ignored the primary interface, which was flashing a torrent of incomprehensible error messages. Instead, she went to a small, unmarked panel on the side of the core's housing unit. She opened it, revealing a thick bundle of fiber optic cables. "I need a standard en-bloc clip and a light pulse reader," she said over her shoulder, not looking to see if anyone was listening. She knew they were. Corman, his skepticism replaced by pure awe, scrambled to get the requested tools from a nearby crash kit. He handed them to her, his hands trembling slightly. "Mom, Doctor, what are you doing?" "The recursive bomb has infected the software at every level," she explained, her voice as calm as if she were explaining how to bake a cake. She deftly attached the clip to one of the cables. "The user interface is a trap. The direct command line is compromised, but the machine still has to talk to itself through its physical pathways. I'm not going to try to fix the software. I'm going to teach the hardware to ignore it." She plugged the other end of the clip into her own, new, undamaged tablet, which Rostova had someone fetch for her. Using the light pulse reader, she wasn't inputting code. She was inputting patterns of light, injecting raw data directly into the system's optical nervous system. It was surgery at the speed of light. On the main screens, the cascading error messages began to slow. The erratic pulsing of the core began to stabilize. The blaring alarms dropped in pitch, one by one, until only a single, steady warning tone remained. Private Miller, watching from the doorway, felt like he was shrinking. This woman, this quiet, unassuming person he had dismissed and denigrated, was performing an act of digital wizardry that was indistinguishable from magic. She was taming a leviathan that had brought an entire military installation to its knees. Her hands, the same hands that had calmly wiped coffee from her ruined device, were now rewriting the reality of their world. She moved with a grace and certainty that spoke of 1,000 hours of practice, 1,000,000 lines of code, a lifetime of dedication to a craft he couldn't even begin to comprehend. Her competence was so absolute, so overwhelming, that it became a physical presence in the room. It was a silent, crushing force that exposed his own arrogance for what it was, the hollow posturing of a frightened child. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than 10 minutes, she removed the clip. The final alarm fell silent. The emergency lights switched off, replaced by the cool, steady blue of normal operation. On the main screen, a single line of green text appeared, "System stable. All networks nominal. Cerberus protocol disengaged." "Welcome back, Dr. Reed." The machine was not just fixed, it was greeting its creator. A wave of relieved, breathless laughter and applause broke out among the technicians. They clapped, they cheered, they hugged each other, the tension of the last hour releasing in a tidal wave of emotion. But through it all, Dr. Reed simply stood, unplugging her tools with the same methodical calm with which she had begun. The climax was over. The crisis was averted. But the true reckoning had just begun. Now came the silence. The deafening, profound silence that follows an impossible act. The technicians and specialists, their initial relief giving way to a deep, professional awe, simply stared at Dr. Reed. They were looking at her differently now. They were not seeing a civilian woman in plain clothes. They were seeing the architect of the very digital universe they inhabited. They were seeing a legend in the flesh, a ghost from the machine made real. Master Sergeant Corman, a man not given to emotional displays, walked slowly towards her. He stopped a few feet away, his face a mask of humility and wonder. "Doctor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been in this field for 20 years. I've seen things you wouldn't believe, but I have never seen anything like that. What you just did, it wasn't in any manual. It shouldn't be possible. Dr. Reed finished packing her tools into a small case and finally looked at him. A small, tired smile touched her lips. That's why they call it a contingency plan, Master Sergeant. You don't write it down. You just have to know how to do it. Her gaze then drifted past Corman, past the adoring crowd of technicians, and settled on Private Miller, who was still rooted to the spot in the doorway. Her expression was not one of anger or triumph. It was one of quiet, academic pity. It was the look a teacher gives a student who has failed a fundamental and very simple test. Captain Rostova stepped forward into the center of the room, her boots echoing in the sudden quiet. The moment of celebration was over. The moment of education was about to begin. She surveyed the scene. The stable, humming corps, the relieved faces of her team, and the shattered arrogance of Private Miller. Her face was grim, her purpose clear. This was not just a technical debriefing. It was a court-martial of assumptions. "Everyone, listen up," she commanded, her voice ringing with authority. The room fell completely silent. What you have just witnessed is a lesson you will carry with you for the rest of your careers. You witnessed the failure of a system, and you witnessed its salvation. But the more important failure did not happen in this room. It happened an hour ago. In the DFAC, all eyes, including Miller's, snapped to her. He felt a cold dread wash over him. He was no longer an anonymous observer. He was the focal point of a narrative, the prime exhibit in the coming lesson. "We have in our ranks," Rostova continued, her voice cold and measured, her eyes locked on Miller, "a culture of assumption. We assume strength comes from a uniform. We assume authority comes from the rank on a collar. We assume competence is loud and boastful." Today, Private Miller here decided to make a few assumptions of his own. She began to walk slowly toward Miller, each step a hammer blow to his crumbling psyche. He assumed that a person in civilian clothes was lost. He assumed that a woman was a subordinate to be ordered around. He assumed that a black person was someone he could humiliate for the amusement of his friends. He assumed, in short, that the only worth a person has is what you can see on the surface. She stopped directly in front of him, forcing him to meet her icy gaze. These assumptions are not just ignorant, Private. They are dangerous. Today, his assumptions led to the disrespect of a civilian guest. In a combat zone, that same brand of arrogant stupidity could get your entire platoon killed. It could compromise a mission. It could cost lives. She turned away from him and addressed the room again. The person Private Miller chose to humiliate, the woman he ordered to get his coffee, the expert he deemed not important, is Dr. Evelyn Reed. Rostova walked over to the main terminal, the one that now glowed with healthy, stable code. She typed a few commands, and a personnel file filled the massive screen on the wall for everyone to see. A picture of Dr. Reed, the same calm, intelligent face, looked out over the room, and below it, the credentials began to scroll. Dr. Reed holds a PhD in quantum computing from MIT and another in systems architecture from Caltech, Rostova announced, her voice a resonant declaration. She is the lead design architect of the entire Aegis network, the code that you use every day. She wrote the original kernel herself as a side project when she was 24 years old. This Cerberus event that just nearly destroyed this base? She designed that protocol as a theoretical failsafe, a final line of defense to shut the system down before it could be captured or turned against us by an enemy. She didn't just stop the disaster. She stopped the disaster of her own design. The technicians gasped. Corman shook his head in disbelief. They had been fighting a ghost, and the ghost herself had come to put her own creation back in its box. Rostova wasn't finished. Under the Civilian Equivalency Act, her position as a Level 5 project director for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, grants her the effective authority and protocol rank of a lieutenant general. Not a captain, not a colonel, a 3-star general. A wave of shock rippled through the room. Miller's face had gone from pale to ashen. The woman he had ordered around like a servant held a rank equivalent that dwarfed everyone on the entire base, including the base commander. Rostova pointed a finger at Miller, her voice rising to a shout that echoed off the metal walls. So let me be perfectly crystal clear to you, private, and to anyone else who thinks like you. That woman you threw coffee on? That woman you try to make your personal servant? She outranks me. She outranks the base commander. She outranks every single person in this room, on this base, and in this entire command. Her mind is a strategic asset more valuable than a squadron of F-35s. And you treated her like dirt because you couldn't see past your own pathetic bigotry. The final sentence hung in the air, an accusation and a verdict all in one. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of shame, the silence of revelation, the silence of a worldview being utterly and completely dismantled. In that moment, Miller finally understood. He hadn't just insulted a civilian. He had committed an act of sacrilege. He had spit on the altar of the very institution he claimed to serve. He had stood in the presence of a Titan and, in his blindness, had mistaken her for an insect. The weight of his ignorance, of his profound and catastrophic failure of character, crashed down on him, and he felt his knees begin to buckle. The story of what happened in the Aegis Hub and the mess hall spread through Fort Kellerman not like wildfire, but like a shockwave. It traveled instantly, carried on the invisible currents of gossip, text messages, and official reports. By lunchtime, every soldier on the base knew the name Dr. Evelyn Reed. By dinner, she was already a legend. The narrative, as it was passed from person to person, began to take on the quality of myth. In one telling, she had stared down the rogue AI with nothing but a paperclip and a stick of gum. In another, she had rewritten the laws of physics to calm the quantum core. The truth, as is often the case, was both simpler and more profound. The story became a parable, a teaching moment that transcended the actual events. It was no longer just about Private Miller's foolishness. It was about the very nature of respect, power, and perception. The spot on the mess hall floor where the coffee had spilled was scrubbed clean within the hour, but its ghost remained. It became a landmark. NCOs would bring new privates to the spot, now known unofficially as Miller's Folly, and tell the story. It became a lesson. Look around this room. See the janitor? See the cook? See the civilian IT guy? You have no idea who they are or what they know. You will treat every single person with respect, not because of the uniform they wear, but because of the humanity they possess. Your assumptions can be your undoing. Private Miller, meanwhile, was living in his own private hell. He was not discharged. He was not formally punished in a way that would appear on his record. Captain Rostova, in a stroke of what could only be described as inspired cruelty, had a better idea. His new official duty for the next 30 days was to be the personal assistant and janitor for the Aegis Hub. He was assigned to Master Sergeant Corman, who took a grim satisfaction in his new charge. Miller's days were a monotonous cycle of profound humility. He swept the floors of the God Box. He polished the gleaming chrome housing of the quantum core, the very machine Dr. Reed had saved. He ran cables, organized spare parts, and refilled the coffee mugs of the technicians who now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. Every day, he was forced to confront the physical manifestation of the world he had been too ignorant to understand. One afternoon, while cleaning a ventilation panel on a server rack in a dusty, forgotten corner of the facility, he found something. Scrawled on the inside of the panel, in sharp, elegant handwriting, was a series of complex equations and a small signature. ER 2014, he stared at it, his rag forgotten in his hand. She had been here before. She hadn't just designed this place from an office 1,000 miles away. She had been here on the ground, pulling cables, tightening bolts, leaving her mark on the hidden guts of the machine. He was literally polishing the work of her hands. The realization was so overwhelming that he had to sit down on the cold, concrete floor. He finally saw the whole picture. Her quietness wasn't weakness, it was focus. Her simple clothes weren't a sign of poverty. They were a sign of a person for whom such superficialities were an irrelevant distraction. Her entire being was dedicated to her work, to the silent, unseen craft of building the world that kept him safe. In that dusty corner, surrounded by the humming monuments to her genius, Derek Miller finally felt the full, crushing weight of his shame. It was a clean, purifying pain. The arrogance was burned out of him, leaving behind an empty space that, for the first time, was ready to be filled with something new. He began to learn. He started asking Master Sergeant Corman questions, not dumb questions, but smart ones. He asked about the systems, about the code, about the theory behind it all. Corman, seeing a flicker of genuine change, began to teach him. Miller started reading the technical manuals in his off hours, the same kind of manuals he had seen Dr. Reed reading. The words were a foreign language at first, but slowly, painfully, they began to make sense. He was starting over from the absolute bottom, building a new foundation for himself based not on bluster, but on knowledge. Dr. Reed, for her part, had moved on. She had stayed at Fort Kellerman for another week, overseeing the implementation of new security protocols and system upgrades, the Reed Contingency, as it was now officially called. She worked quietly, efficiently, speaking only when necessary. She never once mentioned the incident in the mess hall. She never spoke to Private Miller again. There was no need. The lesson had been delivered. On her last day, as she was walking across the tarmac to board a small, unmarked government jet, Captain Rostova escorted her. Dr. Rostova said, "I hope this experience hasn't soured you on working with us." Dr. Reed paused and looked back at the sprawling base. "A system is only as strong as its weakest component, Captain," she replied. "Sometimes a component needs to be stressed to failure in order to identify and correct the flaw. The system is stronger now," she offered a rare, genuine smile. "And I believe Private Miller will be, too." With a nod, she boarded the plane, leaving behind a legacy that was already becoming part of the institutional bedrock of Fort Kellerman. She hadn't sought recognition or demanded an apology. Her vindication was not in the punishment of her offender, but in the undeniable, irrefutable proof of her competence. The quiet professional had done her job, corrected the error, and moved on to the next problem, leaving the rest of the world to marvel in her wake. Her silence had been her shield, her skill had been her sword, and the battlefield had been a contest of character, which she had won without ever throwing a punch. The ripples of that day continued to spread for months, then years. The Miller's Folly story became a mandatory part of the orientation for all new arrivals at Fort Kellerman. It was a cautionary tale, a foundational myth that shaped the culture of the base. The lesson was simple but powerful. Competence has no uniform, and respect is not a privilege to be granted, but a debt to be paid to every single person you meet. The stories serve as a constant reminder that the most unassuming person in the room could be the one holding it all together. The culture of assumption, which Captain Rostova had so despised, began to slowly erode, replaced by a culture of curiosity and professional humility. Soldiers started talking to the civilian contractors, learning their names, asking about their work. The invisible wall between the uniformed and the non-uniformed began to dissolve, fostering a new era of collaboration and mutual respect. Derek Miller was a living embodiment of this change. He served his 30 days of penance in the Aegis Hub, and then, to everyone's surprise, he requested to be permanently reassigned to the Cyber Operations Unit. Captain Rostova, seeing the profound change in the young man, approved the transfer. Miller had to start from scratch, taking the most basic courses, but he attacked his new field with the zeal of a convert. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined focus that reminded everyone of Dr. Reed. He excelled. He absorbed information like a sponge, his past humiliation serving as a powerful, ever-present motivator. He never wanted to be that ignorant again. Years passed. Private Miller became Corporal Miller, then Sergeant Miller. He became one of Master Sergeant Corman's most trusted NCOs. He was known for being tough but fair, and for having an almost fanatical devotion to the principle of judging people by their skills, not their appearance. He often mentored young, cocky soldiers who reminded him of his former self, pulling them aside and sharing his story not with pride, but with a deep and abiding sense of responsibility. He was ensuring the lesson he had learned so painfully would not be forgotten. One day, a new group of civilian specialists from DARPA arrived to install a next-generation upgrade to the quantum core. Sergeant Miller was tasked with overseeing the security and logistics for their visit. As the team of brilliant young engineers filed into the God Box, he noticed one of them, a young woman, looking nervous and out of place. A cocky young private on his detail made a snide comment about her brightly colored civilian clothes. Miller, without raising his voice, walked over to the private. "Let me tell you a story," he began, his voice low and serious. He told him about a cup of coffee, about a quiet woman with a powerful mind, and about the day a private learned that true rank isn't worn on a sleeve. The private listened, his face slowly losing its smirk, replaced by a look of dawning understanding. Later that day, Sergeant Miller saw that same private approach the young engineer, not with a joke, but with a respectful question about her work. Miller watched them, a small, knowing smile on his face. The legacy of Dr. Evelyn Reed was not in the code she wrote or the system she built. It was here in this moment. It was in the quiet transmission of a hard-won lesson from one generation of soldier to the next. It was in the changed heart of a man who had been given a second chance to learn what it truly meant to serve. Dr. Reed herself never returned to Fort Kellerman. Her work took her to other bases, other secret projects, other problems that needed her unique mind. She remained a whisper in the machine, a name in the legends of the cyber world, a quiet professional moving silently through the corridors of power. But her presence was still felt. Her influence was in the salute a soldier gave a civilian janitor. It was in the respectful silence that fell over a room when a technical expert began to speak. It was in the understanding that true strength was not about being the loudest voice in the room, but about having the calmest mind in the storm. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in monuments of stone or bronze. It's what continues forward in the actions and beliefs of those you've influenced. It's a lesson taught, a perspective shifted, a culture changed for the better. Dr. Reed had corrected a flaw in a machine, but in doing so, she had also helped correct a flaw in humanity, proving that the most powerful force in the universe is not arrogance or prejudice, but the undeniable, irrefutable, and beautifully silent power of pure, demonstrated competence. For more stories where quiet professionalism triumphs over loud ignorance, and where character defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.